Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for Love, Hate, and Other Filters by Samira Ahmed. This is a YA contemporary novel about Maya, who's a 17-year-old daughter of two Muslim Indian immigrants. Maya struggles with wanting to assimilate to American culture, while her parents desire for her to embrace a more traditional life. Then a terrorist attack takes place a few hundred miles from her home, and Maya is introduced to hatred and bigotry that she's never experienced before. I gave this book 3 stars. I really wanted to like it, but I think at the end of the day, for all my issues, it was mostly just not a book that was written for me. I picked it up not knowing if it was going to fall more on the fluffy romance side of things, or if it was going to be more about the bigotry and the prejudice that Maya experiences, and it was definitely more on the romance side. And I don't think that's really for me. I don't prefer books that are lighter like that. I do prefer books that have like a heavier theme. And while this did have underlying issues, the romance was always the focal point of the story. It almost seemed to be split in two. The first half of the book was a straight love triangle. Maya is attempting to choose between Kareem, who is an older Muslim boy that her parents have picked out for her, and a boy she has a crush on at school. She's not sure which she's more interested in, and she's not sure what that means for her culturally. She's trying to choose, in essence, between cultures, the American assimilation or her Muslim Indian roots. And I think that was an interesting element, but it was just not a story that I was particularly interested in. I don't like stories that focus a lot on the romance alone. I like for that to be more of a secondary focus in my books, and it was definitely the primary focus here. I will also say that the symbolism was quite a bit heavy-handed, but that aside, the first half of the book was fine. It wasn't anything spectacular, but it was mostly just not a book that I was really interested in reading, and I was kind of hoping it would be something different. And then there was the second half of the book. The terrorist attack occurs halfway through, and the book has an abrupt change of focus. Maya experiences a great deal of backlash for being Muslim after this terrorist attack occurs, even though she had nothing to do with it. She's experiencing the same grief and shock that all of her fellow white classmates are experiencing. But this was kind of where the book fell flat for me, because in the first half I was willing to sort of push aside the issues as this isn't for me. Whereas in the second half, because it did become a little more issue driven, it was much more my kind of book, and the issues that it had came into a great deal more focus because of that. One thing that bothered me a lot in the second half of the book was that this terrorist attack has happened. Her whole family is experiencing hate crimes against them just for being Muslim in the vicinity of a terrorist attack, regardless of the fact that it had nothing to do with them. People are threatening her and her parents. People are physically assaulting them. Her whole life is almost crumbling around her. But even then, she's still more focused on the romance. She's focused on this boy I have a crush on, this boy I really like. I want to date him. I want to go on a date. She spent more time crying over boys than she did her parents disowning her. And it just kind of didn't work for me. Some very serious things happened in this book, and it really felt like she took them too flippantly. And she was very concerned about this romance. This romance meant a great deal to her. But as a 17-year-old, she got kicked out of her parents' house. She has a part-time job. She has nowhere to go. She's still more concerned about the date. She's concerned that she's promised she won't go to prom with this guy because it would upset his ex-girlfriend. And she's upset about that, not literally being kicked out of her house and disowned. And I get that there is a point where, like, you have to look on the bright side. Like, you have to continue on with your life. But it just didn't work for me. It felt like there were these serious things going on, and she was more focused on, like, less important matters that still were important, and I still would be fine with the book focusing on those. But this book felt like it called for much more gravitas than it was given. It also seemed like most of the side characters were very flat and just had a single facet of their personality. There was a racist classmate of Maya's in this book, and his only role was to be racist. That was his purpose in the story. That was his entire personality. He was racist. And there was really nothing else going on there. He had no motivations outside of being racist. He had no likes or dislikes. He had no personality traits. He was just the racist character. And I'm not saying I want him to be redeemed or I want him to have an arc or anything. I just want him to have a personality. And it was the same with her best friend. I have no idea what her best friend's name is. Her best friend was just the best friend who was there to be the best friend. I have no idea any of her personality traits. She was just the best friend. What were her goals? What were her motivations? What did she like? Not a clue, honestly. She was the best friend who existed in order for Maya to have a best friend. And I felt like most of the side characters were like that. Outside of Maya and her family, even her parents to a degree were kind of like that. And the two male love interests, everyone was just a flat, single-faceted character. None of them had any nuance. And if they hadn't been that big of a part of the story, it would have been almost fine. But they escalated everything. It was the side characters who really escalated the plot and who made things much more dramatic. And because they were so flat and they had only that one aspect to their personalities, it kind of seemed like they didn't have any real reason to escalate the story like that. And it felt like it came out of nowhere. And I do think her side characters needed a lot more development. And then we get into the terrorist attack, which I think was one of the things that bothered me most about the story. And I think this is going to be a very minor spoiler. It wasn't the focus of the book, but it was something that happened, so I will leave a timestamp down below for when to skip if you want to skip this minor spoiler. But essentially, the terrorist was white. And for a while, I thought that Ahmed was making a point of mirroring the way the American media deals with and treats white American terrorists. Between each chapter, there was a section about the terrorist attack, and it started out at the beginning. You get the terrorist point of view as the attack happens, and then you start getting other people's point of view right before the attack happens, and then it goes to after the attack, and you start getting media stories and news clips and neighbors who are making statements. And it was very much the lone white shooter narrative, and I thought it was intentional for the longest time. I thought it was very interesting that she was making a point of this. But as it went on, and especially the last couple of chapters, it really didn't feel like that at all. It felt like she was trying to give the terrorist a backstory to make us understand him and feel sympathy or pity for him. And I didn't like that because it's not something that's really allowed for terrorists who are Islamic. Which is not to say that I'm like, oh, forgive them, like, they had hard lives, let's forgive them. My point is that they are not allowed that, but white terrorists in America often are. And it kind of bothered me that she was still embracing this concept. I would have much preferred if she was just like, oh, he's a terrorist, he's a bad guy. Like, that would have been better for me, because the book wasn't focused on him at all. And that was such an unnecessary part of the story. It was about Maya, who really had nothing to do with the terrorist attack, apart from the fact that it happened a few hundred miles away and caused racist events in her life. But there were sections where Ahmed was just explaining through neighbors, through backstory, that this terrorist had an abusive father and that he had a hard childhood, a hard upbringing, and he had a very hard life. And it was like, I don't care. Like, that doesn't redeem him. That doesn't explain why he did what he did. That's just giving him a sob story to make me pity him, which I really don't care to. It wasn't necessary for this story, and it didn't add any commentary to the book or the overall situation of white terrorists in America. And beyond that, there were other small things. The dialogue often felt forced and stilted and awkward. It didn't flow naturally. And I think that was fine for some of the characters, because some of the characters, like her parents, were immigrants who spoke English as a second language. So I was more forgiving of that. That made sense. But all the characters spoke that way, including the American ones, including her white friends, and it didn't flow naturally. There were a lot of pop culture references as well, and I think it did work better in this book, because normally I hate the vast majority of pop culture references, but I think they did work better in this book because it was so much about contrasting the two different cultures, so they had a purpose in the story. But there were still kind of an absurd number of them. There were so many that I felt like it bogged down the story almost to just be referencing a bunch of things constantly, and I didn't enjoy that. I felt like it was one situation where less is more. And she had a brief relationship with an older Muslim boy that her parents set her up with. Kareem was 21. She is 17. And she went on a date with him where Kareem ordered alcohol, offered her alcohol, which she refused, and then proceeded to make out with her later. And like, this is a 21-year-old with a 17-year-old, And that made me very uncomfortable. Like, that is not an insignificant age difference. And the way he was treating it, he was obviously more experienced than her. Maya had never been on a date before, never had a first kiss. And he's much more experienced, much older. It made me very uncomfortable to read, and it was not looked critically at all. So that bothered me as well. But again, that was a very small part of the story, and for the most part, he was a very kind, supportive person. So not the biggest of deals, but I didn't enjoy reading about their date. But beyond that, it still was a decent story. I think for the most part, it just wasn't for me. I was looking for it to be something different than what it was. It was very much romance focused, so if you prefer a more romance focused take on this kind of situation, I'd recommend picking this up maybe, especially if you're a younger audience or if you're looking for books for like a younger teen. I think this would probably work better for like maybe 14, 15-year old, and I think a lot of the issues would have it read better for a younger teen as well. Not that I wouldn't say as an adult don't read this, I just think it's the kind of book that I think adults who read a lot would notice some of the characters and notice some of the plot points falling kind of flat the way I did, and it didn't work quite as well. But it was still a decent story. I thought it was interesting that Maya was very torn between choosing between cultures, and I thought that aspect was kind of well done, even if a bit heavy-handed. And it was an interesting perspective of this young girl who was growing up as essentially the Muslim in this small town, especially as she's kind of a more secular Muslim in a way. Like, I know that's kind of contradictory because a Muslim is inherently religious, but just more Muslim by culture rather than specifically a very religious person. And it held my attention pretty well. I read this in one sitting, and at the end of the day, it was decent. It was a fine book. It was kind of mediocre, and it did feel very much like a beginner author who still needs a lot more time to figure out their writing style, but it wasn't bad. It just wasn't particularly great either, so like, a kind of mediocre 3 stars for me, but it definitely wasn't my kind of book. I am glad that I did pick this up though. Let me know down below if you've read Love, Hate, and Other Filters, and let me know what you thought of it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.